On the last episode of the Keepsake box. "Why does the box bother you so much?" I asked. "The box doesn't bother me," she said. "It's its contents." My eyes grew extremely large. "You pried open the box?" I screamed. "No," she exclaimed. Juanita explained that she had been looking under the sink and found that the lock hadn't been securely latched. Her curiosity got the better of her and she looked inside. "Well," I said, "what's in it?" Juanita told me that I should see for myself. We walked into David's bathroom and Juanita opened the box. Simultaneously, she opened a literal and a figurative box. Both boxes were filled with questions and answers, but the literal box was filled with drugs. Lots of drugs. Now, I'd had some exposure to the drug world, so by deductive reasoning, I was very much aware that David's stash was a personal quantity. It was a hefty stash, but certainly not enough for distribution. Also, I couldn't see a benefit to David selling drugs. He wouldn't take that chance. I had to accept that David was a drug user, and it all made sense. While I didn't know the path that he had taken to get to that point, I understood that something had changed with David. I was fully aware that he took pills. We all did. But David had obviously escalated in his drug use, while Juanita and I hadn't. The time frame was in debate, but it all made sense. That's why David had changed so drastically. He was irritable, uncaring, and aggressive. David had less interest in the outward appearance of our relationship, and that was extremely uncharacteristic of him. I dropped the ball. I didn't zone in on David because I didn't care as much. I put up with his antics and lack of intimacy because I started to care less about our relationship. Juanita was there, and if I had to be honest, that's who I really wanted to be with. I tolerated David because he was the face of my lifestyle, a lifestyle that I wanted to preserve, but that's all it was by that point, public perception. Our relationship had dwindled long before that point in time, and the discovery of the locked box helped me to understand why. I was very much aware, however, that our problem was bigger than drugs. An escalation in drug type had obviously resulted in a change in David's behavior, and Juanita was paying the price for that. Without intervention, we could only assume that things would get worse. I couldn't imagine how David would treat Juanita if he got more advanced in his drug use. Juanita didn't deserve that, and I couldn't suffer the guilt of putting her through that. We had to do something. I thought it out. I knew that I could save Juanita. It would take a sacrifice on my part, but it was worth it. She was worth it. I sat Juanita down and started a conversation. "Juanita, I need you to understand something. Things aren't going to get better for you here. David is getting worse by the day. We need to find a way for you to get out of this." "I can't go back to Central America," she said. I assumed that her experiences there were far beyond my level of comprehension. "What if I can offer an alternative?" I asked. I could tell that Juanita was intrigued. I explained to her that I owned a house and a car that David wasn't aware of. Juanita had no idea that Grandma's house even existed, and she was surprised that I managed to keep the secret from David. I offered Grandma's house to Juanita. It would be a step down from our place. There was no pool, no panoramic windows, and no marble. But if Juanita's life in Guatemala was as harsh as she explained, she could definitely handle it. But more than anything, Grandma's house was safe. She'd be safe. Chapter 16, No Longer. Narrated by Shandora Warren. I remember it so well. It was a Friday. It was bitterly cold. The type of cold that reminded me of when Ron used to make me hang his clothes outside on the clothesline. I allowed myself to get lost in the thoughts of better days that were to come. I imagined how happy Juanita and I would be once we were out of David's grasp. I did something that day that I hadn't done in years. I pulled out my Whitney Houston CD, the one that had been given to me by Antonio. I sang loudly. A part of me broke whenever I listened to that song, but another part of me was still strangely attached to it. I put "Where Do Broken Hearts Go" on repeat, and I never tired of it. I'm not sure how many times I listened to that song, but before I knew it, David was walking through the door. He walked in like it was any other day, only it wasn't. It wasn't like any day I'd experienced prior to or since. David gave me a peck on the cheek and went into the living room. I smelled an odor on him that I couldn't exactly place at the time. Present day, I know exactly what it was. David placed his briefcase on the table and cheerfully requested that I join him. "Let's talk," he said. He told me that his only request was that I completely hear him out without interruption. I agreed and sat beside him, completely oblivious that my world was about to be turned upside down. David, very calmly, delivered my worst nightmare. He said, "Shelley, I want you to understand that very few things happen without my knowledge. However, I find it humorous that you believe the contrary. I'm sure you don't know this, but there are cameras in every room of this house." "That's right, Shelley. I know everything. Everything. I know that you and Juanita have been having an affair. I'm fully aware that this has been going on for a long time. I watched the first time that you were intimate with her without me. It occurred in the pool house. It was a Thursday and I was working late. I've allowed you to live in this fantasy world with Juanita because I have long tired of the both of you. I also know that you found my drug box. I don't want you to inflate your importance. I wasn't ever hiding the box or my extracurricular activities. I didn't think it was any of your business, and I governed myself accordingly. But since you found it, understand that my business is mine, and mine alone. It will be beneficial for you to be cognizant of that fact henceforth. Now, to the important stuff. I have been, and always will be, several steps ahead of you. I watched my cameras every day and noticed that you were taking Juanita's belongings out a little at a time. At first, I assumed that you were supplying your whore with a new wardrobe, but I noticed that you weren't ever bringing in anything new. I watched every day, giving you just enough rope to hang yourself, and boy, did you hang yourself. I let you tell me that Juanita just went away, and I pretended to believe you. I watched her come into this house and cook and clean. I laughed at the assertion that you'd actually think I would believe that you were cooking and cleaning that well. A small part of me was entertained by it. I watched you have sex with her in our house, in our bed. I tolerated because my plan mandated that I do so. I will, however, give you a little bit of credit. It was quite clever to have me believe that you had given up that little house in the country. But keeping in line with the fool that you are, you went there every day, never expecting me to figure it out. You led me right to her. So that's why I'm a bit late today, sweetheart. Unfortunately for you, your little situation in the country is no longer. You're set to receive a hefty insurance payout, but as the executor of your estate, trust me when I tell you that you won't see a penny of it. Don't look so surprised, sweetheart. You don't remember signing all of your assets over to me? But I have the paperwork right here. David opened his briefcase and removed a manila envelope. There, in black and white, were multiple notarized documents bearing my forged signature. David laughed as I gasped in horror. It was a hearty, boisterous laugh. "What did you do to Juanita?" I asked. David laughed again. "I didn't do this, sweetheart. You did this." I was immediately taken back to the moment when Sharon uttered those same words. You did this. And just as I had that day, I experienced a feeling of absolute dread. I didn't know the details of what David had done, and I knew that he wasn't going to tell me. But whatever it was, I felt responsible. My attempt to save Juanita had most likely been the catalyst for whatever David had done to her, and that was just the beginning. David said that I was due for an insurance payout that I wouldn't see. Taking his words into consideration, I could only assume that David had destroyed Grandma's house. I felt so guilty, like I had let Grandma down. My heart was in that house, in more ways than one. I hated David, a sentiment that I expressed. He laughed and informed me that the feeling was mutual. I was infuriated, and I addressed him. David, sometimes bad things happen for good reasons. It's very obvious that you don't want to be with me, and I certainly don't want to be with you. You have taken everything from me, and I don't even care. Keep the money. I just want to be free of you." "Well, there's one problem with that," David said. I countered his assertion with a question. "What problem would that be?" David stood, ensuring that he towered over me. "The problem with that is the fact that I'm not letting you leave." I told David that he was crazy, and I would very well do as I pleased. And that's when he delivered the rest of his news. He said, "As I stated, I'm always several steps ahead of you. I've been getting and failing to pay things on your credit for months. You couldn't get a one-bedroom shack in the slums with your credit. You could have gone back to your house in the country, but that's no longer." David started to laugh, and I could tell that he was legitimately enjoying the interaction. I had one question. Why would he even want me there? I cheated, ensuring that our prenuptial agreement would work in his favor. I provided an out for Juanita against his wishes. Additionally, he admitted that he wasn't attracted to me anymore. Wouldn't it be better for him to let me walk away? David's explanation advised me of how sinister he really was. He said, "I refuse to get divorced. I've poured a lot into making sure this marriage looks perfect, and I'll continue to do so. You will continue to do so as well. Also, Juanita was here for a very specific reason. I was only able to be decent to you because I was able to project my frustrations onto her. But since you so carelessly took that away from me, I can only assume that you want to take her place. Henceforth, you will not work outside of the house. You will do everything that Juanita did, and you will pretend to like it, just as she did. Actually, since I'm sure you'll miss her, I'll call you Juanita, if you prefer. And one more thing. You are no longer allowed to play that stupid Whitney Houston song in my presence. I hate that song." David laughed as the tears formed in my eyes. I had severely underestimated him, and I was about to pay dearly for having done so. I was stuck, and David knew it. He set it up that way. I hadn't ever imagined a set of circumstances where I would be that out of control. I hadn't felt that way since my days with Ken, but I had no crutch in my situation with David. There was no reward from the police. There was no grandma's house to relocate to. David had forged my signature and gotten control of all my assets. I could leave and try to figure it out, but where would I live with the credit that David had demolished? Sure, I checked behind him, but I already knew he was telling the truth. David was meticulous in that way. As an additional gut punch, I knew that he would expose my relationship with Juanita if I tried to leave and pursue guardianship of Cassidy. I was certain that he had videos that would back up any claims that he would have made. That's how David operated. He left no stone unturned. David had me in the rabbit trap, and I couldn't see any way out. So I stayed. I didn't stay because I gave up. I stayed because I needed to figure things out. I didn't want to walk away empty-handed. Additionally, I had to ensure that I was in good enough standing to fight for custody of Cassidy upon my departure. David didn't deserve to win. I had to be smart about it. He would meet me at every turn, and I knew it. And things changed drastically after that day. David stayed true to his word. He treated me the way that he had previously treated Juanita, only worse. I awoke every morning at the crack of dawn. I placed David's iron clothes out, the clothes I'd ironed the night before. While he showered, I made the bed and started breakfast. I did everything to David's expectations. Well, I attempted to, but it wasn't enough. It wouldn't ever have been enough. I tried hard to please David, not because I cared about his happiness, but because I knew there were consequences otherwise. In any instances where it was understood that I didn't meet his standards, David used my shortcomings as the reasons why we had to delay our pursuit of Cassidy. According to David, if I couldn't handle the basics, I couldn't be expected to care for Cassidy, someone who I'd taken care of before I was old enough to do so. David was unusually cruel. He placed 7 envelopes in the kitchen drawer every Sunday. Even though they were all placed there on the same day, I was only allowed to view the contents of the envelope for that day. I thought about Cream a lot during those times. I remember how I thought she was crazy for not looking at the envelopes that Antonio sent for me. I realized she wasn't crazy at all. She was just aware of the consequences, as was I. David had all kinds of ridiculous requests for me. Some days, it would be as simple as something he wanted me to wear. Other days, it was more extreme. He controlled everything, even down to the decor. I wasn't allowed to place anything in the house that wasn't approved by David. The only pictures that were allowed were ones of us, specifically done for the purpose of looking the part. We had 2 photos in our bedroom, one of Juanita and one of Cassidy, specifically done for the purpose of taunting me. I miss Juanita and Cassidy terribly, but I couldn't openly grieve my loss of them. I'd learned that any show of emotion would be used against me, and I couldn't chance that. David supplied me with a debit card that only contained a limited amount of funds. Every morning, he transferred my allowance onto the card. I was always given enough for items related to the household and for outings that would allow me to look the part. If at any point during the day, David felt that I had spent too much, he would turn my card off without so much as an advance warning. I would be responsible for calling to explain the details of my excessive spending. If my explanation was to his liking, the card would be reactivated. If not, I had to go the rest of that day without money. Without regards to what was going on in my world, my card was always turned off at 8 p.m. No ifs, ands, or buts, even on Thursdays when he didn't come home. David had cameras all over the house. He would occasionally recount what I had done that day to make sure that I knew he was watching. David wrote down the mileage in my car before he left work. He derived pleasure from having me under his thumb. He verbally acknowledged as such. David was brutal. If the food wasn't seasoned to his expectations, he would strike me and make me start over. But because 7:30 was his prearranged dinner time, he always chose to eat out. Upon returning, David would congratulate me for getting it right, but he would throw the food away. He didn't want to eat the food. He just wanted to know that I would have done it to his expectations, had he chosen to eat it. While we were outward friends, I was expected to engage to David's expectations. If I failed to do so, there were consequences to follow, usually in the form of physical or emotional abuse. I was still expected to look the part, even though we barely spoke at home. If I didn't portray the epitome of perfection, David would punish me. Punishments varied from beatings to activities that caused physical or emotional discomfort. On one occasion, I chose not to eat the dessert that was offered by one of his colleagues' wives. I politely declined, as David was very strict about my weight standards. Upon returning home, David advised me that my actions had reflected negatively upon him. According to David, I had come off as rude and disrespectful. That was intolerable, as he took a lot of pride in his interpersonal relationships. As a punishment, I was forced to eat an entire cheesecake after dinner. But because I had exceeded my caloric intake for the day, he forced me to run on the treadmill until I had burned off the extra 1,500 calories. David went to bed and left me to my business. The next morning, he asked how many calories I had burned the night before. I answered honestly, 1,500. Apparently, he had checked the packaging and realized that the cheesecake actually totaled 1,523 calories. David delivered a savage beating. Additionally, he further delayed our acquisition of Cassidy. My inability to follow instructions had alerted him to the fact that I couldn't be trusted to care for Cassidy. At least, that's what he tried to have me believe. I thought about Tina a lot in those days. I identified with her in a way that I hadn't ever expected to. I remember my words, and I always ended up being disappointed in myself. I told Tina not to be afraid to step away from situations that no longer served her purpose. I had talked her into doing something that I couldn't do, and I hated that. I hated myself. I hated sex with David. I was disgusted by him. And while he was just forceful with Juanita, he derived pleasure from raping me. He told me that he enjoyed it. David often called me Juanita when he raped me. That was another one of the lowest points in my life. The entire situation was disheartening. I was initially hopeful that I could find a way to beat David, but I started to lose hope. He was always a few steps ahead of me. Along with the brutality, David's drug habit escalated. He no longer found it necessary to lock his drug box. I referred to it as the P3 box due to the fact that it was full of pills, powders, and patches. If David retrieved the P3 box, I assumed that violence would follow. The only benefit to David's drug use was the fact that he spent more time away from me. He was either consumed with drugs or other women. I knew that David was cheating with several women. He didn't attempt to hide it. David brought other women home and had sex with them while I was in the other room. He did so loudly. I pretended to be hurt because I knew that the hurt was David's intent. But truthfully, I was elated. I was repulsed by him. If he was with them, then he wasn't with me. I had no complaints about that. I spent the entirety of my days thinking of ways to get myself out of David's grasp. But in typical David fashion, he continued to be several steps ahead of me. The life that I thought I would have had with him was certainly no longer. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shinny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.